right, guys, we're going to get started. Thank you again for coming to the Winter 2020 Midday Talk Series. Before we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging that the land we are meeting on is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This land is also now home to many other diverse First Nations peoples. All settlers, including recent arrivals, have a responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge the history and legacy of colonialism in this and other lands. We are very excited today to have Zeina Koreitem with us. She is an alum of our own MArch2 architecture program and have continued to earn an MDes in design computation from Harvard GSD, where she received the Daniel Shodek Award for Technology. Zeina is now teaching at SciArc, after also teaching at Harvard, USC, and University of Toronto as a former colleague. Zeina is also the founding partner with John May, also a former colleague here, of Millions, a Los Angeles-based design practice. Recently selected as the winner of an international competition to reimagine the West Wing of I.M. Pei's Everson Museum in Syracuse, New York, with construction starting very soon, I think summer 2020. Millions' experimental work has been featured in solo and group exhibitions at the Friedman Benda Gallery, Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York, Architecture and Design Museum of Los Angeles, and many, many others. Millions, and also separately as John and Zeina, have been extremely prolific in their writings on digital culture. Specifically, Zeina's writings on computational color, computer graphics, and communality have been published in Project Journal, eFlux, and Harvard Design Magazine. Today, Zeina will be giving a talk on the work of Millions, covering a range of projects from computational images to furniture to museum interior. There has been a ton of work, if you follow them on Instagram at all, coming out of Millions as of late, from books to, and I have 2 books, winning competition entries and exhibitions. So it's a great treat for us to have you back in Toronto and to have you present your work at this juncture of the firm's development. So without further ado, please join us in welcoming Zeina.
Hello, does this sound okay? Thank you so much, Vivian. Very generous intro. I'm very happy to be here. Like Vivian said, I was a student, but also taught in the undergraduate program before this amazing building was finished. So you guys are lucky to have this building. So today's lecture is called The Loose Collection of Objects, Images, and Text, and in some ways it compensates a little bit the ethos of The Office, in which we're sort of always immersed in different types of productions. So we'll make objects, of course, material things, graphic things, images, but also text, as Vivian mentioned. There's a lot of writing, especially John. So our work, maybe just to give you a sense, is framed generally by 2 ideas. The first idea is a sociopolitical idea of representation, and I won't touch on it too much today, but in some ways we try to find ways in which architecture can be, to some extent, countercultural. We ask questions like, how do we live collectively in a time where we're increasingly living individually and in the current neoliberal climate, and we also ask questions about materials that might participate or help think through the ecological crisis, but I won't really talk about that today. And then the second idea tries to build on the legacy of what you might think of as, or what might be called a digital architecture, which is what Vivian also mentioned. And we try to extend these ideas into a spirit of experimentation and we try to work with emerging media and platforms to figure out what to do with them, basically. And so one underlying principle in the work is that the tools and the instruments that we use are inseparable from the way we think, and that these tools are not neutral. They're not neutral vessels for ideas. They form the basis of how most architects think, and that's our position. How we think, but also how we represent the worlds and the objects that we produce. So the first idea is, this is a quote from Sloterdijk that was published in Log in 2017. And we both really love this paragraph, and in some ways it exacerbates or exaggerates this idea of the kind of individual program versus the collective program, and how they are, if they were the innovations of the 20th century, they were increasingly relevant also in today's culture. We look at things like the Epsilon still from the Proposition d'Habitation in 91, the extreme solitary unit, versus something like this, like the Dodger Stadium in LA, built in the 60s, or the Hollywood Palladium concert hall in the 40s, this extreme kind of crowd and collectivity. And these really fuel a lot of the things we think about in the office. And then, of course, the architecture tools, which, until recently we thought of, or we call them orthographic tools, like plans and sections. But the way we see them is that they've changed slowly, maybe in the beginning, and then gradually in the recent years. And then, of course, this changed dramatically the way we work with the introduction of computers and electronic media. Into our display, into architecture. So it opened up the field in ways, and it resituates also the way we produce work. So alongside the conventional drawings like plans and sections, we are now modeling, we're 3D scanning, of course, we're using VR, we're using mixed reality technologies, et cetera, augmented reality, and this really changes the way we work. So in some ways, in part, my work and Milling's work is really simply about understanding how to become literate in these new media. And here you're seeing some of the early sort of 3D scanning experiment we did. And we also think of software and hardware platforms as being kind of hand in hand and one in the experimentation. So the crucial aspect in the work and also in our practice and pedagogy is the assertion that literacy is not possible. That is important, and it's not simply skills training. So it's not about just mastering a tool, but it's also about understanding how we can intervene in the tool and to reflect critically. So it's reflecting critically on the tool and the skills that emerge from the tool. And in our work, this has meant recognizing that so many tools we use today are imported from other fields. And so we always like to think of ourselves as perpetual amateurs. And we think of, we try to remember that some of the visualizations and the production technologies come from the sciences, they come from engineering industries. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but what happens is that what is important is also the values from those disciplines, like accuracy, efficiency, precision, predictability, control, and everything that falls under workflow optimization. And so at the same time, there are other qualities that are minimized, like errors, accidents, uncertainties, unpredictabilities, noise, mistakes, inaccuracies. And so all these qualities in architecture that we might have traditionally seen as maybe crucial for experimentation and discovery are eliminated because of how some of these tools are set up. So this is really central in the way we work. And here you're seeing kind of completely messed up 3D scan of the primitive solids that you saw earlier, in that if you place the object in a certain way, use certain materialities that the 3D scanner cannot recognize, and even rotate them or move them in ways that the 3D scanner cannot recognize, like linearly, you start to get visualizations that are not a one-to-one connection between the object scans and the image. And these we see as opportunities. So, like I said, without the literacy to intervene in these processes, maybe we risk to feel like the software starts to dictate our process and the terms of our work. And so we try to open up and expand and examine this relationship between the user and the tool. So our work breaks down into two kinds of explorations, and today I will sort of show you an overview of the work, and you'll see there's a couple different categories, and there's not necessarily a direct relationship between all of them. So the main two categories that I will show today, so the first group is what we might call Proto-Architectural Experiments, and some of the earlier 3D scanning experiments is part of that, in which we isolate the experiment from a whole series of external realities like social life, political issues, scale even, sometimes even gravity when they remain in the screen, so that we can focus on fundamental technical questions and sometimes material questions. And we've created a list of verbs for ourselves, like stacking, folding, extruding, cutting, terms that are common and that a lot of our colleagues work with, that allow us to narrow down the experiments. And these proto-architectures that are also, they don't really have a beginning or an end in some ways. They're just sets of questions that are impulses on their end that just kind of keep moving forward over time, and they keep developing in parallel to the more traditional work. And then the second group, alongside these sets of projects, we ask more expansive questions. So, like I said earlier, social, political, cultural questions. And what you'll see today is mostly questions about domestic habits, collective living, contemporary domesticity, and then we're also increasingly interested in thermodynamics, but I won't show that today. So since the beginning of our practice, we've studied and experimented with something that we've called, somewhat vaguely, computer graphics. And we mean by that a number of visual effects that are increasingly permeating architecture today, and which of course already dominate many visual cultures and art practices. So here you're seeing the first use of CGI in Hollywood. This is Westworld. I'm sure some of you know this. And it was implemented in the 70s. And in the scene, you see the robot basically perceives the target as a pixelated effect. And this was computer generated. And computer graphics is, the more you look into its history, you realize it's a very messy term. I mean, for engineers, it's pretty stable, but for most fields, it's not. And it's used differently in different fields, actually, and it has to be studied through different lenses. But commonly, it's defined as pictures, films, creating using computers, and this description hardly begins to give it an account of its histories, but it's helpful for us to think of it as just the practice of making images, let's say. As a way to address the somewhat blurry nature of computer graphics in our work, we focused on the structure and the technical capabilities of still and moving images. And this, for me, required a return to maybe the origins at a time when images were not standardized, softwares, packages like Photoshop or After Effects were also not present, and so artists were not familiar with these techniques, and they had to collaborate, in fact, with engineers to produce and figure out how to produce whatever aesthetic objectives they had in their minds. This is still by Mary Ellen Booth in 1948. And so in the early days of video production, a small group of artists tested the manipulation of, or the possibility of manipulating signals in TVs. And this is sort of first instance of video synthesizer experiments. Carolyn Kane, who's in the audience, has written a lot about this. And this created patterning, modulation, shapes. But what's interesting is that these effects are not only produced in a kind of digital way, but also physical way, in that you're literally distorting the screen and the wires, let's say, of the screen. So it's very material. Here's another example. These are all stills from videos, actually, which maybe I should have brought. But the study began as, there were some analyses that we did. We looked at a couple different stills from different films, from a span from 40s to 70s. And we mostly looked at the routines. And it wasn't about generating a theory of any way. It was really just to understand and investigate the image-making routines and how they were developed. And then we also realized that the culture of images is one in which effects proliferate. So these effects are very indeterminate. I mean, we use them all the time. We all use them. But they are significant and they're present. So we started looking at more and more videos. There are many. I mean, this is Poem Field by Stan Vanderbeek, in which he produces images using the computer, but also colorizes the film literally with a brush. So again, this interesting hybrid between operating physically on the film and then producing images with the computer became really interesting for us, because it means that you're manipulating both hardware, software, and the material itself. And that produces very unexpected results, for example, and discoveries. And the other discovery that was interesting is that there's always been an intertwinement between three phases when you make images, which is the pre-production, production, and post-production, and that's very common in film. But it is interesting to start to realize that an imager, or let's say a skilled imager, knows what is possible, and so they know what to do in pre-production in order to produce the image that they imagine. And so there's a kind of circular process between all these three phases. So then the question was, what really goes into the making of images? What composes them? How are they different from drawings? What is really happening to architecture on the influence of computer graphics? So we began to test this set of experiments as part of an ongoing series. It feels like it never ends. And those projects are always happening in parallel with the others, so there's not necessarily a direct relationship. And what we did is we started by rendering primitive solids just to understand the different processes of rendering, like ray tracing and others. And at times we just worked with cones and spheres and cubes, just things that we're very familiar with and that have a history of in many visual fields. And we also started to test to compress them and to work with compression aesthetics as a way to learn about their underlying structure. And because computational images do not exist without color, computational color or numerical color, color really became a central concern for the study, and became a sort of interest of mine as well. And exploring colorization required learning, becoming literate, and literally the RGB make of a computational color system, and how it's sort of put together to produce the image. And it involved this dissecting the structure, and what you're seeing here is, it's not playing, is it? Okay. An image that is literally kind of exploded in 3D. I've dictated the size of the pixels, but it gives you a visual understanding of how the RGB values, the brightness values, and the threshold values, black and white, highlight, shadow, is sorted and parsed, and it's typically it's just a list of numbers, but here you start to see really like visually what it means. And the result is also randomized noises, errors, failures, accidents, and distortions. The process is intentionally recursive, repetitive, so that objects and images are reinterpreted in many ways and at different stages. So once you start to do so, I've done a lot of these, but once you start to do them, you realize that maybe as an architect, the difference between perhaps a visual artist and architect is that materialization and scale is always something in the back of our mind. And so I became interested in trying to extract information from these images, like line work. How do I segment them? How do I classify them? Am I classifying them by shape, by color, by area, inertia, degrees of circularity? So I've tried a couple different levels, like detecting the edges, the corners, the blobs. And these were ways to work in a non-orthographic manner, meaning not through plans and sections, while still using the tools that we're familiar with, like plans and sections. So we're extremely comfortable with the line. And so I began to start to think about how one could even attempt to not just extract content, but also produce specification drawings of these images, as though we were to build them or something. The spec drawings can be placed in relation to one another. So here you start to see an attempt at three-dimensionality, and then using traditional ideas of, or Rhino ideas, let's say, of extrusion and lofting and others, I began to start to experiment with making three-dimensional volumes that a 3D printer could understand. So these are about maybe 25 by 25 centimeters, 3D prints. And they were tested, the same processes were tested through different rendering engines, so there's always like a strange inversion that happens. What happens when you re-image the object, what happened, and then you produce line, what happens if you produce an object from a line, and it's just this weird, there's this like strange kind of recursive process that starts to get you at something that's less expected. And the second study resulted in a second set of models, and these are much larger. They're 3D printed sand objects. And here you see the details. And like I said, I was really interested in the kind of recursive nature of this process. So how can a 3D scanner interpret these objects, and then how can, you can then kind of place the objects in conversation with their own images and project these same images onto them. Here you see them in their projection environment, and you start to kind of read what we call digital solidity. This is an ongoing one where we're trying to now produce the exact opposite, which is not really a solid but thin object from the same process. I'm hoping to fabricate these soon. So the second series of projects, so alongside these experiments, like I said, we try to ask more expensive questions, and sometimes they coincide with the commission, and other times they're speculative. And the questions are about habits and routines and domesticity. And these are sort of the first scale of architectural considerations. So I'll take you through a few projects that explore digital solidity, as you saw, and digital subtraction in the previous setup, but alongside program, scale, and tectonics. So this project started as a commission in Beirut, and then we renovated the war-torn building below, but we didn't end up doing the penthouse. But it allowed us to then kind of push it further and test ideas around, again, thinness and thickness, and some thermodynamic considerations at a domestic scale. So we questioned the idea that in a modern domestic interior, rooms are typically assigned and designed according to their function. But in general, these room assignments do not change day to day. And we were interested in this idea that we could create a non-static program, let's say, using solidity and thermal mass, and the variable thickness of walls, and the climate there, Mediterranean, helped also maybe facilitate this possible speculation. We began to explore the idea of the unprogrammed architecture in a single-family setting in which new habits could emerge out of these challenging thermal conditions. So they would change day to day or day to night and then season to season. And in reality, this approach really to this kind of interior depends on, typically it depended on HVAC, but in this case, if you get rid of HVAC, what happens and how do you then modulate that? So then the service and the storage spaces were thought of as being embedded in the thick northern wall section, while the southern facade was cast thin to minimize exposure. And then you see that from the beginning, we really wanted this sort of single communal space beneath a large sort of fat interior ceiling where the bedrooms were packed above. And the reflected ceiling plan became a driving instrument. So you also see the strategy of front plan as a way to, or as a mechanism to produce variable thickness and different sort of spatial effects in the section. And we tested it while understanding that the entire mass would lag several hours behind the natural diurnal cycle, which is actually pretty similar as California's climate as well. This is a sectional model rotated upside down 90 degrees in which we started to test the organizational system of the interior, but also the ceiling strategy, and it's a 3D sand print, pretty large. So extending all of these questions, we've extended them to collective living questions. So this is a project that is that we started in 2015, I think, and it's now kind of ongoing with a couple different typologies. So what you'll see today is just one typology, which is a typology of the tower. And the project in some ways merges the earlier experiment, which is the kind of materialization and techniques that are computational, and then ideas, more traditional architectural ideas like program, poché, circulation, thinness and thickness, difference and repetition, but it doesn't have a site. And we wanted to see if the contemporary digital ways of working could produce an experimental housing typology, and a speculative one. And we were interested in the concept of poché, redefining solidity as a hollow volumetric space where we embed functional elements. So very similar idea. So we do a lot of these digital sketches. We call them wire sketches, and they work hand in hand also with the process of whatever fabrication tool we're using. So like these are, you see similar representations usually if you work with a CNC mill. But in this case, we were working with multiple axis wire cutter that cuts foam. So these representations start to draw the kind of profiling or the lines, the path of the wire, and then the volumes within them that would subtract a possible bounding box. So we wanted to challenge some of these ideas about collective living, but more importantly, we wanted to eliminate the corridors. So that was our first rule, in place of these paths, what we called profiles that you see on the edges and that cut the block. It'll make more sense in a second. So these frames, they outline the bounding box, and they become actually like tectonic tools in themselves. And in this project, the idea that an object is simultaneously data and material started to kind of materialize here. And it's played out across a number of our projects, but in this one you see it maybe clearly in the animation, where there is pretty much like data being kind of run through this thing, and none of it is material and none of it is 3D printable yet. And representationally, you start to also see that these objects are depending on the limitations and the possibilities of both the software and the 4-axis wire cutter, which actually is a dumb tool, but was effective for us at the time. So we engaged in a way of profiling. It produced excessive circulation, huge spaces for traversing the structure, excessive vertical space, and in some ways the project has a bit of a kind of nostalgia, let's say, to the early experimental spirits of modern housing, but we knew that we couldn't duplicate that. So in some ways, it wasn't necessarily about finding a utopia, but about figuring out the kind of processes and the techniques that could produce a new type of massing or a new type of form. So these are horizontal sort of slab studies, where you see the profiles that run through them from one end to the next. And then we also did what we called also vertical studies, which tested sort of internal atria subtractions for light, etc. And then the combination of all of it becomes the tower, which is essentially a gradually multiplied serial projection and serial cuts that are combined together. So refer to these as possible plans. I mean, they merely begin to suggest unconventional patterns, but they're not. You see the distributions and sizes of spaces, but they're not fully developed with stairs and things like that. We also start to see the spatial atomization that happens through between the kind of rules and limitations of the cutter and the mass in between. We really like to move between scales and techniques. Like the tower here that you saw is stacked pieces that the wire could cut. And then we were interested to then 3D print it as a seamless thing where you eliminate the series of like lines that are visible from the stacking of the slabs. And it always helps us approach the work in different ways once we do that. The next project, so I'll go a little bit faster in the next two. We were approached here to design a furniture set for a show in New York at Friedman Bendau, and they asked us to produce a furniture set that is sort of exemplary of what we've been interested in the office at the time. And we had already been looking at the history of pre-modern bathing. And we started to realize that in the early 20th century, two changes have transformed the space of bathing. The dimension of the bath became set as a one-sided porcelain tub that we're all familiar with, cheaper to produce than the cast iron freestanding tub. So it narrowed it down, but also with the invention, of course, of the wet wall as a construction technique. In the 90s, it set the dimensions and the arrangements of the modern bathroom, and the modern bathroom essentially became a room in a house. What we realized is that the bath became a solitary activity almost at the same time as it also became a room in a domestic setting. And when you look carefully at the history of pre-modern bathing in many, many cultures, you realize how much that practice has changed over the past century. So what used to be basically entering an extended social period of whether conversation, relaxation, or even some semi-collective self-care became reduced to a private, more solitary, efficient, hygienic routine where you're by yourself in front of a mirror. And so we were interested in maybe returning to that long tradition and to think about how that happened in different cultures, what are the commonalities across cultures, what are the bathing elements that were designed, and you start to realize they were all in the round, actually, because of their nature to be shared. And so for our set, we wanted to establish this like circularity, multi-sidedness, and just the idea of a shared, maybe a loose organization of objects in the round. So basically, in our proposal, we reintroduced and proposed a freestanding wash basin and a bathtub, and also these sort of thermal surfaces that you see here, the rectangular shapes. They're meant to be for sort of leaning down or lounging, and they would be warmer. So the basin and the tub, the idea would be that they were 3D printed in sand so that they could have like these unusual insulative properties. And then the third component, like I said, the thermally radiant stone slabs, actually we ended up using concrete, white concrete. So we called the set Bathing Again. In many ways, this project is really a continuation of two themes in the practice in recent years. The one, just the idea of collectivity at multiple scales, and then and the reimagining of routines around objects, so people and objects really, and how that would kind of rethink the way we live around them, and also our interest in large-scale 3D printing. So finally we ended up fabricating the wash basin with two-part 3D printed, and then the stone the concrete slabs. Partially because of space, it's too big in the gallery. So basically, you've got the 3D silica prints of the two parts of the slab that come together, and then the floor tiles that are fiberglass reinforced white concrete. How am I doing with time? I'm okay? Okay. So two more projects. So this one is called Jack Irwin Flagship Store. It's their first store in New York. The program is pretty straightforward. It's a shoe store at the time, male. Now they've expanded into two genders, I think. But for us, it was an interesting brief because they wanted a flexible space, and they wanted also the store to also be an event space. So we started to get really interested in this idea of also a or multi-programmable project around like loose elements. And so we experimented with similar materialities and colors that we had been doing. And we built a stage in the middle that is that can come apart to become separate tables, or they would sort of combine and become a stage that could be used for many different things, including display. And then we also designed these boxes that are also flexible, and they're aluminum boxes, and they could be kind of rearranged in different ways. And then I'll end with this one. Vivian mentioned that we recently won competition to reimagine a part of the Everson Museum in Syracuse by MIdday. And this project is really interesting on many levels, actually. I mean, the brief, in a nutshell, is a cafe and a display system for ceramics collection that they recently acquired. But actually, it started, the way the brief was set up, which I'll talk about in a second, started to raise very explicit questions about relationship between public and archive, the back of house, the front of house. So began really to kind of dig deep into the history of ceramics itself, and in parallel with the history of the museum and how MIdday had conceived of this wing of the museum. So maybe a brief summary about the collection. So the donor, who's Dallas-based collector, Louise Rosenfield, she had amassed a pretty eclectic collection of functional ceramics over the years by mostly contemporary American artists. So there's about, now I think there's 3,200 actually. She keeps adding more. And she donated them to the Everson Museum. Her one rule was that the pieces must be used, so they cannot just be displayed or looked at. And she explicitly said that they would be used until they're all broken, except for the last piece, and the last piece would then be exhibited like a piece of the museum. And we were really fascinated by this radical idea, like many of our colleagues who participated in this. And she imagined that the last piece would go to some other archive. So in some ways, there is a kind of journey to this ceramic. So the competition was rooted in this very idea, and we also used it as a kind of driving force, or the priority, let's say, for the design. This radical idea of use in the context of the museum, not only, like I said, fueled the brief, but also got us thinking about maybe an unusual approach to art curation and art display. So, like I said, we researched ceramics, communal food cultures, natural light. We found incredible construction photos of the museum in the 60s. You can kind of see it in the background here a little bit. And you start to realize that the quality of the light, I mean, it's a very dark space and not appropriate at all for displaying any kind of objects or any kind of archive, really. There's an intense chiaroscuro in there, and as we looked more into it, I realized that it actually was intentional on IMA's part. And the concrete also intensifies this by completely absorbing the light. It's Syracuse, so there's a very long kind of winter period, so there's not much light coming into the space. So we became fascinated by two elements. First, having infinitely thin intervention that is almost not there, but that also has a drastically atmospheric effect. Hence the prismatic glass, which itself has a very delicate presence, but also can produce like enormous effects if well done and well set up. You'd get lots of refractions and things like that. So we started to think of these shafts as being a kind of conveyor of light, let's say, but also an archive in itself. So one of the things you start to realize when you look at the collection is that individually they're kind of strange, but then when you see them together, they're amazing. I mean, it's really just the quantity and the intense eclectic nature of them. They're also different. I mean, I don't even know what their style is. Maybe you could say classical American, I'm not sure. But so together they're amazing. And so we thought that if these shafts could, bring light, but also produce a visual archive that could start to maybe address the brief. This is the atrium space that is meant to be mostly curatorial, although they were hoping to also do maybe more special events. And so we conceived of a family of elements that could serve as what we called curatorial surfaces, both horizontal and vertical. And in the end, we proposed, again, a loose collection of discrete elements which provide flexibility for curation, but also common eating, communality. So the elements are the glass tower, the lightweight movable feast tables, which I'll talk about. And then we also produce these sort of demonstration gallery podiums, which are supposed to be used for real-time demonstration events in the gallery across, which actually you don't see here. And there were other material strategies, but these were the main elements. And basically, the display cases that we refer to as the towers or the prismatic towers, the idea is that the visitor can reach out, pick a piece, drink from, eat from, and the visitors could also pick at point of purchase. But there is a kind of constant interaction between whoever's picking a piece and whoever's sort of like looking at the entire archive. And the main furniture elements that we are currently in design development are the tables, and we refer to them as movable feast. The tables are meant to bring the ceramic pieces into the open. You display in the middle. They're the tables are arranged as a family so that you can kind of create different configurations. But they're also too deep in some ways, and there would be elements beyond arm's reach, essentially. We also thought of these as 4-unit types that they are designed in such a way that a minimum of 3 have to be joined in order to be in equilibrium. So they would produce, we're interested in having them produce a kind of large table that almost like forces communality rather than these single individual tables like typical cafes. Okay, so it's in design of development, and I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zeina. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Maybe I'll jumpstart us off, as I always do. Zeina, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated the range of works, and it's nice to have an opportunity to see them all together. I wanted to ask you a little bit about this idea of maybe being in control and potentially out of control. And related with that would be the computer as a participant or a design collaborator, or at least the software. It's clear that, I mean, I'll kind of leave it at that, but there seems to be a trajectory where, earlier on in the projects, it really does seem like you're in collaboration, or Millions is in collaboration with processes that are controllable and yet somehow out of the realm of control. And then as we get into more clearly client-related projects that, you kind of like push the computer back into the back as the help again. So I wanted to reflect on that across the projects.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, because it comes up in the office a lot, for sure. And it's, in some ways, like we see there's the realm of the kind of the graphic, the image making realm, and then there's a realm of making things, and they don't quite communicate yet. I mean, 3D printing is as far as we've come in terms of if you produce an out of control image, some of it might be understood by a 3D printer. And we're really interested in this tension. We're also really interested in maybe making physical things that don't just have a kind of complex aesthetic of computer graphics, but that are complex in the way they are conceived, but not necessarily in the way they look, if that makes sense. So, so it's not the objects are not the aesthetic of the computer graphics. There's a different kind of tension that emerges when you think of them as pretty dumb, relatively primitive things. Does that?
Yeah. I think that elaborates. Any other? Yeah, I'll come to you.
Hi. Yeah, about the idea of use, I guess I'm like curious to ask whether you used your the bathing again installation personally, and like how was it?
How is it used?
Like if you used it personally, like or was there a water component to it that?
Yes, so there's a faucet. Unfortunately, it just kind of sat in the gallery. I wish we could take it home, but we couldn't. But it would be in the middle of a space rather than against a wall, if that makes sense. Is that the question? So it would be larger than what you think of as a typical room, right? So rather than it being for 1 or 2, it would be for, let's say, 6 or more, right? And then it would be circular, so we'd have to have space around it to be used. It could also be outdoors, depending on where you are.
Got it. Yeah. So it's not like a working prototype in that full sense?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they commissioned it as a prototype. It's one of 3 editions, but they're sort of in the gallery. Yeah.
Hi, just over here. So just going through, I read Signal Image, and you sort of, or John spoke about these sort of tectonics of different medium, whether it's physically writing mechanically by hand, or taking a photo, and the sort of capturing of light as the sort of photograph. How might data be a sort of driver for some of your work, and what might that mean in a period where there's sort of more and more data being collected, whether it's in a city or online or personally for ourselves? How might this sort of further impact your practice or further work?
Okay. Well, I'm not John, but I'll do my best to impersonate him. I think for me, data is the process of conceiving and imagining possible forms. That's for me. There are obviously other aspects of data that we face every day, like information and urban data, all kinds of things, right? But in the work you've seen today, it's part of the tools. It's the data that the tool generates, essentially, to make either images or objects. And then the toolpath as well, we think of as data. Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Is there a last question? Did I see a hand? Okay. Last question, and then we'll call it a... You guys give me a
great questions.
Back and forth.
This is another question about the bathing project.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, like historically, bathing culture is kind of formed around societal structures and the way that people interact, I guess, in previous times. And so how is this bathing set reflective of contemporary times? Is it kind of a statement of how we're always sharing things on social media or something, so then you're like kind of also sharing this previously private activity again?
Mm-hmm. Very good question. Yeah, I mean, I think this also what's strange about this set is that it's not a building, because of course, like bathhouses are typologies that are that emerged in many cultures, and they're very fascinating typologies as well, because some of them were, actual kind of separate buildings, like in the Ottoman bathhouse or others, and then in other cultures, the bathhouse just kind of took on any kind of building in the urban fabric, and it just became an interior, right? So this is a strange. So if there's a scale of the, let's say, Ottoman bathhouse, a scale of the interior, almost adaptive reuse bathhouse, and then this is a scale of almost a furniture room type bathhouse, right? So I think that that's pretty contemporary in some ways. That to think of bathing, sharing bathing as a loose aggregation of collection of objects in an existing room, I think that's pretty contemporary. And then also the method, the fabrication of it is pretty contemporary. The silica sandprint that produces like also unusual like thermal oscillations when you fill it with water, which was very unexpected for us when we tried it. Yeah.
Zeina, thank you so much again for your lecture. Clap for us.